Hey, so this video that you're watching right now is actually one chunk of a much larger project I've been working on the last few weeks. Been in a bit of a creative rut, been kind of bad at content, and I think this show deserves a lot more credit than it would have gotten in the original video. It comes at the very end, it's the longest segment by far, so I wanted to release it early and subject you to another 20 minutes of me talking about some show that nobody knows about, but that I think is actually pretty interesting.
Welcome to the show!
The concept of Xavier Riddle is a completely original idea stemmed from the success of this biographical book series for kids. The author and illustrator had a tight lock on the feeling these are supposed to invoke, and when asked to convert the books into an animated spectacle, they gave this rogues gallery of historical figures a singular point of reference that connects them all. A group of 3 kids that consult a historical hideout to visit each person and learn little life lessons along the way. The trio heard described as follows. The inspiration for Xavier came from my own house. My youngest son is a dreamer, so enthusiastic, but he can't tie his own shoes. Yedida will grow up to be the president. Brad is anxious about everything. He has delusions of averageness. Keep this guy in the back pocket. We're going to come back to him in a bit. The genesis behind its adaptation is pretty interesting. This was essentially a whole new concept, definitely melded with the series that wouldn't normally be palatable to this type of format. The justification is similar to every other answer typically given, but the execution is pretty top-notch. Like the amount of detail thrown into these transitional characters just so we can learn a couple things about Abraham Lincoln was pretty incredible. For one, I have to tip my hat to the aesthetics. It's definitely one of the more cinematic TV cartoons I've seen in a while. It's a bit hard to pinpoint. While there is a sophistication to its trappings, it still keeps the ethos from getting too melodramatic. Peep that opening track, it'll start to click after a listen or two. The orchestration in general is pretty cool. In shorthand, I think of it like Night at the Museum Light. They tend to give everything a grand scale, even when the goofiest shit is happening. The art direction easily makes it one of the most complex of this whole lineup. The amount of ground they cover in about 35 half hours takes us to some of the most interestingly ornate scenic designs this side of animation can offer. Keeping in mind, too, that they would typically never reuse the same historical backdrop twice, and you have to take a beat to admire it. The main character design is cribbed from the books, being described as a loving mashup of Charles Schulz and Bill Watterson. It was smoothed out and streamlined pretty well for the animation pipeline. You're gonna love the subtle line boil they attach at certain points. All the kid characters are outfitted with these giant bobbleheads, but nobody feels particularly out of place. Believe it or not, you can get a lot more subtle character acting done here, even with those beady little dot eyes.
Call me the plant doctor because I'm always helping plants. It's important to take care of the earth.
I don't know if I'd say Xavier Riddle is a sharp show with super clever writing, but I think it does have a specific edge to it. The main trio is at least a bit self-aware, and the main framing device has them open and close every episode as a separate performance. The premise of the series itself is played off well enough, but the characters are their own comedy of errors. There's such a smooth delivery of all the banter and the extra bits that makes each of them stand out. As smart and morally just as they may be, they're still at times impulsive, a bit unfocused, and just not open to certain things. The main trio are a lot like regular kids, and favorably are far from interchangeable. I did want to focus on someone specific though, more notably, a character that would be content out of the spotlight. But his involvement in the show is emblematic of the type of progress that the show tries to make with the kids at home.
Oof! That's gonna hurt.
Brad is one of the most inverted self-inserts I have ever seen. He's essentially the author of the original books shadowing the escapades of his creation. He gets to travel back in time every day, and he still finds time to roast himself. Honestly, I think Brad's the most integral character of this outfit. He's sure not the title character, but the way he moves throughout the show provides a great arc for the audience to follow. If you're above the age of 7, you are likely watching this show from his perspective. He's not exactly the straight man, but you'd likely have more in common with his way of thinking. Everybody knows a Brad. I'm sure some of you watching right now may be that Brad. It's not a super uncommon position to be in. A little neurotic, slightly risk-averse, silently determined person that's still a bit lost in the weeds and trying to find themselves. When I first heard of him, he seemed to be like a transparent Charlie Brown XB. It's not nearly as depressing, but he is definitely a bit down on himself. The kid that plays him is also kind of typecast as this happy-go-lucky ball of sunshine, so the juxtaposition in my head was a lot more dramatic. Cody from Total Dramarama is one thing.
Can we get more rice pudding? I love hospital food.
The Bat Kid from a few shows back is another.
Did you see that? She rolled it back. Yep. My little sister is great at learning things.
And Brad is just Brad. Reliably so.
To the secret museum. Allergies and time travel? This is not my day.
Despite his close kinship with the Riddle kids, he's not connected to the museum formally, but he's arguably the person that leans into it the most. Like, typically the Riddles get a lot of obvious advice for their predicaments, for the merits of slowing down, learning to be an active listener, being careful with your words and everything. Almost all of Brad's solutions that are tailored for him culminate in life-affirming shit. He's being asked to stretch his legs and open his horizons. He's learning from the more practical teachings too, but the ones that are made for him are pretty aspirational. Being reminded to be open to new experiences and share more of yourself is the type of stuff that you likely would identify with more. His struggles are twofold. He's obviously going through kid stuff, but he's also going through these sets of experiences that have to reinforce Brad to be Brad. Like, there's nothing wrong with being a Brad. The show doesn't penalize him for being Brad. We just need to see him come into his own more. He's learning to be the Brad, unabashedly and more enthusiastically Brad. When Brad gets the double whammy of lesson learning, the audience gets to take that end result away for themselves. Whether it's a Brad or not, we are living vicariously through him. We are also being taught to give ourselves the same glow-up and attention in each major episode. And that can be a really gratifying trip to go on.
Ready to go back in time?
You mean back in time? Get it? Because his name's Bach? Funny.
Philosophically, Xavier Riddle seems to follow a very idealistic tack. Clearly the show is trying to push the audience into doing their own research rather than giving the whole lecture. Its moral compass is simple, not terribly fleshed out. It's supposed to get kids thinking and motivated to do more. In any conversation about racial relations, they will always talk up the tenets of equality rather than equity. Mostly pure and blind acceptance of good over bad, rather than exploring what makes good and bad and the nuances of it. I think the approach can be a bit contentious, but the lean towards positive affirmation and reinforcing the values they teach are a major focal point. It lays it on quite thick, but the vibe of the show makes it a theatrical experience. The show and the people behind it seem to have a strong desire to present the target audience with real heroes. Anytime Brad Meltzer, that's the author dude, was pressed about the origins of the book series, he would usually refer back to his kids and his goal of diverting them from humanity's current social ills. This mission takes on another layer of dimensionality within the context of the last few years. History will have a time recapping the last half-decade. From what I could gather, the timeline of the show's development likely started either early into the previous presidency or within the final months of the 2016 election cycle. There's plenty of cartoons produced or greenlit during that era that are more invested in being kind and humanistic. Xavier Riddle carries some of that energy too, but it also carried a lot of concrete lessons to take away and knew how to cement them. While the main plot is busy inspiring its way into a lesson plan, it does grip you in different ways. By far, this is the most mysterious entry on this whole list. There's so many details sprinkled in and kept for continuity's sake. But the more you learn about the universe, the more questions you end up having. I've seen basically most of the current batch, and I still have so many thoughts. Like, where is the show set exactly? Where is the museum, and what's the origin story of the Riddle family museum? What makes this thing a secret? Is it an open secret? Is it a secret how it's still kept open? Is the government in on this? It's clearly a family institution, but they don't live here, do they? Wait, how do they live here? How come these school-aged children are almost never seen inside a school? Why are the historical figures they meet still children with full beards? How does Brad get to stay over day in and day out? Where are his parents? Where are the parents? How did he become part of the museum keeping team? He clearly wasn't there his whole life. Why does everyone in this godforsaken dimensional paradox run like Charlie Brown? It's hilarious, but it's distracting. Even certain details dropped during their movie, they had a movie, don't really demystify anything. They squeezed like 5 episodes in one, and they only answered like 2 questions. Biggest ripoff of the decade. It should be noted that the series structure can be a bit counterintuitive in certain angles. Obviously, the lessons it espouses are mainly meant to inspire the audience to go through these experiences with gusto. It can't give the full lecture, but the SparkNotes version is just enough to get the point across. The historical aspects are likely already considered a secondary focus, but in certain episodes it becomes pretty obvious when the course of the plot can become limiting. Like, each moral they run through applies to each figure, but some certainly fit better than others. Sometimes the specific focus can easily gloss over other important traits. I also noticed that while each moral of the episode is not really out of place for each hero, the scenarios and events they show to get the point across sometimes clash spectacularly. Sometimes people do point out the narrow focus that these have, but it's usually aimed at like the minor factoids and things. There are whole episodes that talk about why someone's important and not like explicitly talk about what they did outside of the framing. There's a wild episode they did on Jonas Salk, the guy who created the polio vaccine. They highlighted him and show off how good it is to do good without expecting anything in return, how helping people, even without being rewarded, can easily be its own prize. And the catalyst that sent the 3 of them to him was that they shoveled the museum steps and they didn't get any hot cocoa in return.
No hot chocolate at all?
And after all that hard work.
You know, I think these vague connections work better for more prolific figures like Einstein or Earhart. You know, these are people that kids already can identify. The more obscure people they highlight aren't always done in a roundabout way, but certain episodes are positively confusing in approach. Moreover, a lot of the episodes featuring black historical figures are pretty hit or miss, not only because their episodes may swerve a lot of their important accomplishments, but the nature of the featured events themselves. They will showcase everything about Rosa Parks sitting on the bus, up to the part where they threw her off the bus. Or maybe they'll sideline the various advocacy done by George Washington Carver just to talk about his secret garden and taking care of plants. They didn't even talk about the peanut products. How do you swerve all those peanut products? It's been said that the Jackie Robinson episode was received poorly enough that it may have been shelved from American broadcast, but don't quote me on that. A contentious point of the episode reinforcing that Jackie did invite a prejudiced little white girl over to his house for a snack, even after she kicked him off of her lawn.
You have to treat everyone fairly, no matter what. If you do, they just might come around and treat you fairly too.
Now, philosophically, the main motivator behind the show may pale in comparison to what's being talked about. It's difficult to really delve into the equality we're supposed to have between us if we can't dig deeper into the inequitable bits too. The gang's reactions to slavery and the subsequent descriptions are a bit on the nose.
And I thought being treated differently because of my coat was bad. Being treated differently because of your skin is terrible. And really wrong.
I imagine that the target age range for the show may have held them back in some regard, but scenes like this may ring hollow without the proper context involved. I'm moreover a bit surprised they didn't leverage the main characters to speak deeper about racial inequity. 2 of the 3 main characters are brown. You'd think they'd have a bit more to say in this area, even if they're speaking from a presumed point of privilege or ignorance. It would have been cool to perhaps see them think through the implications of racism.
Hey, why isn't everyone cheering?
Like, instead of letting Jackie Robinson just carry on unopposed during that one game, they could have been having a conversation amongst themselves, likely running through some other reactions the audience might have, like anger or fear. It is racism, after all. You can kind of do that. You have some flexibility there. All that being said, I wouldn't call this a bad approach per se. It's a pretty complicated tack to try and break this down for a kindergartner to be able to understand. There are likely many cringy drafts of those slavery sequences hidden away somewhere, but at the end of the day, the show's delicate approach to these issues is definitely more helpful than it could have been.
That bust would make an awesome museum exhibit. Oh, right. It already is. Burby, let's go home.
Xavier Riddle was funded for 37 half hours, along with an hour-long special marketed as that film. As I write this, PBS seems to have released all but 3 episodes, one of which is a half-hour season finale centered around Fred Rogers. Apparently these 3 have aired up north in Canada and in Europe somewhere, but not on American television. As I was wrapping up the script for this video, it was revealed that they would be airing these last 3 episodes pretty soon. But it is pretty unclear whether the project will be revisited for new content. It's been a bit over 2 years, and there are no hints or indications that it would be recommissioned. It seems like shows from this modern era are greenlit in a bigger than usual batch, and they get split up into seasons if it's popular, which is not exactly new strategy in the industry. I don't think they really even have hiatuses. I've been told that this show has been on hiatus for a while, but I don't know if that could even really apply. I mean, Steven Universe is one thing, and this is a whole other thing. So I don't know if they have hiatuses, but when it's all said and done, that's seemingly the end of it. There's a few other shows that been on the lookout for a while, like Pinkalicious and Molly and Eleanor especially. But allegedly, they might not be going anywhere. I'm not quite sure how a renewal would work out. PBS politics are a bit complicated, and I'm sure the pandemic has not helped in this regard. I think the reason why Xavier Riddle resonated with me so heavily was that it seemed to exemplify the point of its broadcaster so thoroughly. Through a combination of its philosophy and teaching style, it crafted a formula to captivate space against a backdrop of total pandemonium going on in the real world. There's plenty of shows in this lineup that are popular or perhaps well-renowned and respected, but those chumps are, again, victims of their own success. They can keep up with the curriculum, but the data and the sponsors start to drive the motivation and the stories after a while. Xavier doesn't have the benefit of years of experience with trial and error. The source material isn't even a decade old yet, apparently. At times it does share a couple of flaws with the main character, but its energy and aptitude to inspire kids is what stands out. It has the same zeal as the shows and figures that inspired Meltzer and the crew. Half a century from now, there will likely be powerful people in every sector that can harken back to this show the same way that we harken back to Clifford and Cyberchase. Kids like them will surely change the world, and Xavier Riddle will have deftly led them down that path.